If we move up to the upper right hand corner, we'll see a little cog up here. And if we click on that, it says Update System Settings. And it's going to bring up a dialog box that gives us our different options that are available. We're going to take the time and go through these settings again so we can confirm what we have available to us for our initial configuration of this Unity VSA. So when we look at this administration screen, we'll see that we're first in the section for software and licensing. If you had a Pro edition of the Unity VSA, you would be able to see that here, and it would also give you all the different options that you have licensed. You notice we don't have EMC Proactive Assist available to us in this listing. We also do not have data at rest encryption. Neither one of those are available to us with our licensing type. The EMC Proactive Assist isn't available to us because we're using the Community Edition. Data at rest encryption just simply isn't available for any version of the Unity VSA, so be aware of that when you move forward. Next, we're going to click on Software Upgrades. On the Software Upgrade screen, you'll be presented with some system information. You'll have the name, the model number, the serial number, but you'll also see the current release of the Unity OS. You'll notice we're on version 4.0.0.732.9527, and it shows the release date. If we want to do an upgrade, we can go download new software. It's going to take us out to the EMC support site. We'll pull down that new set of software, and we're going to perform a health check, which goes through and does a validation against the system to make sure everything is performing and functioning as expected. This is more applicable to a physical environment than it is a virtual, but you still have to complete this step regardless. So once you've performed the health checks, you'll go ahead and click on Start Upgrade. You'll add your packages, and you'll go through that software upgrade process in order to get this Unity VSA up to the newest release of Unity OS. We aren't going to step through this process because that's not going to be applicable to what we're attempting to accomplish with these modules. But know that that information is available off of the software upgrades section for the software and licensing portion of the settings dialog. Next, we have language packs. If you want to have a different language available as your Unisphere language, you can install a language pack, and that can be done here. Then system limits. System limits is important because we need to understand what our particularly licensed version of Unity VSA can do. In our case, we've got all these items listed to the right-hand side. We have a max pool count of 16, max virtual disk count of 16, max LUN count of 64, so on and so forth. The one most appropriate to us because of the Community Edition we're using is the max pool capacity in total. That's 4 terabytes. If this was a professional edition, it might be that you're going to see 50 terabytes or you'll see 20 terabytes, whatever the case may be. Whatever you're licensed for, that's what's going to show up here on the right-hand side. Let's move on to the users and groups section. Users and groups are handled in a couple different ways. You're either going to install a local user, and that's the screen that we're on right now. You'll notice we have admin listed there. That was the account that we logged in with. I'm going to add a new one, so I'm going to click on Add a New User. And that's going to take me through a user wizard. We're going to add a local user in this case. We now need to specify the username and password. I'm going to create a user named Ryan, and the password is going to be the same as our admin account for simplicity here. So I'm going to say pass123 hashtag and pass123 hashtag. And if they validate, you'll get the next button available. So we click on next. Now we have to select a role. There's 4 different roles available for you when creating a user. You have administrator, storage administrator, operator, and then VM administrator. So you have the opportunity here to go through and review what each one is capable of doing and understand the impacts to the environment. More than likely, you're going to want to set up rights that are appropriate to your particular user base that's being added. In my case, I want to be an administrator of the entire array. I want to be able to make every configuration change possible and available to me. So I'm going to leave it at administrator and click next. You're presented with the opportunity to review your selections. In our case, they're accurate. So let's click Finish. And as it processes, it's going to add that user. Again, it's going to take a moment. But when it's done, it's going to show you the results of what has occurred. So what's happened here is that we've been 100% successful in the addition of our user. So let's close the Create User or Group dialog box. So the second option for authentication on a Unity VSA is using directory services. What do we mean by directory services? Well, it's a standard LDAP configuration. So LDAP has several different variations. It's a pretty standard tree of authentication. It's basically like a big address book of users and additional information about those users, like first name and last name and things like that. Most times, people are going to utilize their centrally configured LDAP infrastructure. So you can use Active Directory, you can use Open LDAP. There's a bunch of different schemes out there, or schemas available for different LDAP configurations and different LDAP platforms. So use the one that's most appropriate for your environment. I would highly suggest you do not use local accounts. You should use Active Directory authenticated accounts, so you can not have to worry about your user base using multiple credentials across different infrastructures. This reduces the risk of storing passwords in an insecure fashion and allows you to have better track capabilities when it comes to adding and removing users in the environment. If I were to add an admin via Active Directory through this method, I could disable the Active Directory account, which would then also disable authentication for the Unity VSA at the same time. Within this dialog, you would make the most appropriate configuration settings for your LDAP environment. Make sure you reference the manual if you have any questions. Next, we have the Management tab. In here, we can see multiple different options that are available to us. So first, the system time and NTP. Notice that right now I'm sitting in a central time zone, and the time is correct for what's displayed on this page. Since we already did our configuration during the initial configuration wizard, you can see our NTP servers are listed. Now we're going to go to DNS Server. The same thing applies here. We can make DNS changes like we did in the initial configuration wizard, and those can occur from this point in the interface. The next couple of options here are going to vary for your particular need or applicability. So Unisphere Central, as we talked about earlier in this course, it allows you to administer multiple different Unisphere-based storage platforms from a single interface. We're going to skip past this because we're not going to do a configuration. Unisphere IPs gives us the opportunity to review or change the name of our Unisphere storage array, change the IPs, add IPv6, whatever the case may be. That allows us to make those changes after our initial deployment. You may choose to do this, you may not. It's entirely up to you. Once you have it established with a particular IP address, it can be changed. It's highly recommended that you don't, though, because it can be complex to deal with if you do have a mistype or you have some type of issue. So just be aware that this option is available. You just might avoid it unless you absolutely have to or wish to seek assistance from EMC support if it's a licensed pro version. Next is remote logging. Remote logging is really all about sending remote logging. What this allows you to do is have a centralized log server like a security SIM or something like that, where you're doing aggregation of security logs, and this would do the same thing. It would allow you to remote log the authentication information, different errors on the system, things like that, through this remote logging server. Next, performance. We have the ability on a Unity VSA to limit I/O. This is a super sweet feature. It allows us to make sure that we can apply some limits or some capabilities or some bands of quality of service to the infrastructure so we don't overpromise and underdeliver on our services. So we have the ability to activate or pause the host I/O limiting capabilities of this platform simply by coming into this section and clicking on pause. Last in this section is encryption. And like I stated before, a Unity VSA, whether professional or community edition, cannot be encrypted. So the mode is going to say unencrypted and the status is going to say unsupported. If you had a physical Unity, you would have the ability to see that it was encrypted or unencrypted, and then you would also be able to back up the key store, which is an integral part of data at rest encryption. If you don't have the key store and you have to do a restore, then you've essentially lost all data and you don't have any way to recover. Next is the storage configuration. Under the storage configuration, you have a section called FastVP. FastVP is basically a configuration capability for you to apply data to the storage system, and then based on its I/O requirements and the performance that it needs, it'll move it up and down within storage tiers. So because we have the ability to do storage tiers, which are different levels of performance of disk, so we can have some nearline SAS, we can have some SAS disk, and we can have some SSD disk, we can have them all in the same storage pool. We have the ability to then do data relocation. Well, data relocation says, I've got this one block of data storage that needs to be on faster disk. So during the schedule, depending on what we set up, it will relocate that block of data to a higher tier of disk. So depending on your configuration, you can set it up to do it multiple times a day. You can do it just on Mondays, just on Wednesdays. You really need to just understand what your environment requires and make the configuration changes as needed. Next, we have spare disks. In a Unity VSA, this is really not going to be an applicable configuration option. In a physical Unity, spare disks would reference any available disks that aren't currently being used in an active storage pool. Next, we'll click on Support Configuration. Here, we have the ability to put in a set of credentials to access the EMC support site. Well, why is this applicable? If you are using a professional edition of the VSA, you would want it to be able to go out and pull contract information as far as your maintenance contracts go, have direct access to ESRS, which is the EMC Secure Remote Services, which is basically a capability to allow you to send diagnostic information and EMC to also be able to remote in if you allow them to do support assistance. So you would apply those credentials here. Next, the contact information. This, if it were a physical device, you'll notice the Unity VSA doesn't have the option. If it was a physical device, you have the ability to put in an owner's name, a physical location like rack or cabinet or something like that, and it allows you to be able to physically locate the device somewhere in your environment. Finally, in this section, we have the EMC Secure Remote Services tab, and you'll notice in this case, ESRS is not configured, so EMC won't receive notifications about issues with the storage array. We don't have any reason to configure that today because it is a community edition. But if you were doing this in a production environment, you would want to set up an ESRS server and then point this box to that ESRS server to be able to proxy information out to EMC for support assistance. On the Access tab, we have a bunch of different configuration options available to us. The first configuration option is CHAP. So CHAP is basically a secure protocol for iSCSI, and it gives us the ability to put in a username and then a secret to be able to make sure that the communication or the conversation between the storage array and the host are happening in a secure fashion. In our environment, we don't implement CHAP, so we're not going to configure this at this point in time. But if you do, based on your configuration in your environment, you would set up the settings that are appropriate for your need. We also have a Recover Point tab here, and we can set up CHAP for Recover Point as well. So with the communications between Recover Point appliances, which is basically a rollback in time replication capability, you can set up secure communications for this particular infrastructure as well. Now we're going to select Ethernet. The Ethernet ports tab allows us to configure those Ethernet ports that we set up during the initial deployment of the Unity VSA. So you'll see we've got Ethernet port 0 through 3 and then the management port. If we needed to make a configuration change, we could simply select that particular object and we could hit edit. We're going to have a limited number of options that are available here. So it's going to tell us the health status, what SPA it's connected to, the actual speed you're connected at, the MTU, and then any network addresses that are associated with it. So in our case, we're not going to make any changes. We're going to click cancel. And because we don't have any reason to change anything on the screen, we're going to go to the routing tab. In here, if you needed to set up specific routes in your environment, in order to get networking to function properly, you could do that here. The last item in this section is ISNS configuration. So it's basically a name registration server. So it allows you to have more of a controlled deployment of iSCSI. If you don't know what ISNS is, it's more complex than you're going to need for your environment likely, unless you are concerned about security and controls and you're starting to implement this for the first time, then you're going to want to do the due diligence and research associated with ISNS. The last item on this particular dialog is alerts. And in here, again, we have the ability to see our configurations. The one button that's exposed here that we didn't have before is send test email. So you have the ability to send a test email and validate that your email configuration works. If we click on preferences, this is very simple. We have general preferences. Things come out with a specific language, so email alerts and Snmp traps will come out with English as the language. And then we can also change the threshold alerts or show all pool threshold alerts available for the environment. And last for the alert section is Snmp. So Snmp gives you the ability to use a monitoring tool and uses the Snmp protocol in order to communicate, send information, send traps, gather information from this particular storage unit. So configure this in your environment if it's a requirement and make sure to apply your configuration. The last thing for the settings screen that we're going to cover is the initial configuration wizard link. Down here at the bottom, as I hover over that link, it says restart the initial configuration wizard. So what that's going to do is take us back through that initial wizard that we went through earlier and allow you to reset up those configurations from scratch and have it apply over the top of what you already configured today. Since we don't need to do that and we haven't made any other changes to our environment, we're going to go ahead and click close. That's going to take us back to the main dashboard for the Unity VSA. This completes the Perform Administration via Unisphere module.